We're here today at the Blaser Mills office at headquarters in Marlow with the wonderful Alex Kirk, who's going to talk us through all things conveyancing. So I think conveyancing can be really complicated and a bit scary for lots of people. Lots of people haven't done it for a long time, so we're going to break it down into lots of easy to answer questions, and I know that you've got a wealth of information to share with everyone about how to make it easier.
I do indeed. Well, I hope to help anyway.
Absolutely, you've told me so many great stories already. Well, not stories, but like great bits of information, which I think will be really useful for people. So I think we were just going to start with, what is conveyancing? It's quite a big, scary word. Lots of people haven't done it for a really long time. So when you are selling your home, what is the conveyancing process?
So conveyancing is essentially the legal process in which to buy or sell a property. It's a process that it can be incredibly time consuming, it can be incredibly stressful. It's probably one of the most stressful things that anybody will ever embark upon. So really I think it's important to be armed, prepared and ready to go, which I know is something you're very passionate about.
Absolutely, I love that, absolutely. Our approach for selling houses and listing them on the market and working with solicitors is absolutely get everything ready as much as you can, because it really helps push through, and I know that you've got lots of examples of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the process itself is I like to describe it as piecing together a jigsaw.
Okay. So
you need all of the pieces of the jigsaw before you can then proceed to exchange of contracts. So, and that's the very big deal. That's when the property becomes yours on a contractual basis. You haven't completed, you haven't purchased the property, but at that point you're locked in. You can't really withdraw unless you're willing to lose at least 10% of your purchase price.
Yeah.
So in terms of the jigsaw puzzle, there's various components of that. So there's the mortgage offer. If you're purchasing a property, you may need finance. There are the searches, so that's the legal searches that we will carry out on your behalf. So that would be things like checking that the road is adopted by the council, or if it's a private road. Are there flood issues which can arise? Are there issues with tree preservation orders or conservation areas? Is it a listed building? And all of these things can have complexities and issues. So very important for a buyer to understand those things. And as if we were acting for a buyer, we would be raising legal inquiries based on the contract pack prepared by the seller's solicitor.
Yeah.
So again, this goes into preparation. When acting for a seller, you want to have as much information as possible to present to reduce down that number of inquiries that are raised. But those inquiries are essentially questions that I would be saying, have you got the planning permission for this extension? Have you got building regulation approval for this extension? And so forth. And that bit can take a lot of time when that information is missing.
Yeah.
Again, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And essentially, any surveys that may be required, that would be another piece. Until everybody's happy, until we've got all of the information to hand, all parties are ready, and then we exchange contracts. And as I said, that's the big bit.
Yeah.
That's the exciting bit. That's where you tend to open a bottle of champagne that night and start booking your removals.
Yeah.
And then obviously once we've exchanged, the completion date is then the date all the money changes hands, the keys are given over, and if you're selling it, you move out, and if you're buying it, you move in. And then you have another bottle of champagne.
Excellent.
I would suggest.
I like thinking of it in ways of numbers of bottles of champagne that you can have.
Yeah, that's
really
my...
But actually the jigsaw analysis is really helpful. So from a seller's perspective, I think people think that they list their home, they go onto the market, you try and get a buyer, and then once you're under offer, I think most people would think of that as the big bit, but actually the next stage, and what we're seeing is that around only 52% of the homes that go under offer actually go through to completion, and what we're trying to do is help people work out how they can get from 50 to not be one of the 48% that falls through. So from a seller's perspective, you would advise on prepping as much documentation as you can, so things like FENSA certificates for windows. And so do you have, and we do share a list with people of things that they can start to prepare, but do you have any advice for people who are selling as to how they can get themselves ready for that process?
Yeah, for sure, and it's exactly the right approach, and it's the approach that we recommend, which is get your team ready. So you've already made your decision on your estate agent, instruct your solicitor, you may need some tax advice. You may want to have that early, and then as part of the onboarding process for a solicitor, you would fill in some paperwork, and that paperwork, they're called the protocol forms, property information form and fittings and contents form. They are industry standard documents that help to understand where the gaps might be, because it will ask you questions such as, have you made any alterations? Are you near a river or stream? Have there been any floods to the property? Is there a private road? Do you pay for any maintenance of anything? And at that point, on instruction, we would then review all of that paperwork and say, hang on, have you got your FENSA certificate? Have you got your HETAS certificate for your wood-burning stove? Have you got the certification for your oil tank or your septic tank? So the quicker and more information that you can compile at that very early stage, we can start closing those gaps and making it easier for a buyer's solicitor to raise those inquiries, because we want to keep those short to a bare minimum, really, because any lengthy inquiries just take time.
So your advice would be any questions, any forms they have to fill out, the more information that they can put in, they're sort of putting themselves in a stronger position, because then there's less questions for the buyer's solicitor to ask.
Yes.
And you're sort of helping to reduce the timescales on that.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. On the fixtures and fittings form, so providing as much information as possible is really helpful. Do you have any examples that will help people see how important that is, whereby missing out bits of information has enabled a buyer to renegotiate on a sale, or perhaps even worst case scenario, pull out of the sale?
Indeed. I mean, it's so important for clarity. I think that is important in the whole selling process. I had a client who was purchasing a beautiful property. It had been extensively refurbished, and they assumed, as did I think the selling agent, that all of the additions were included, such as the cooker tap, the wine fridge, various other items, that even the bathroom mirrors, which were attached and fitted to the property. It was only on the reveal of the fittings and contents form that it actually was the case that all of those were going to be sold separately with an additional price tag attached to those items.
Okay.
Which did cause a great deal of upset, because obviously the price had been negotiated assuming those items were included. In fact, they were not, and so relations were damaged as a consequence, because it felt that there was no trust and confidence between the seller and the buyer, and that was problematic. So I think in that situation, and going forward, I think when you're completing these forms, you do need to think about what are you going to include, and so things that that you may want to remove, such as a wine fridge. Then you need to be clear about that, and if you're happy to leave it, then you suggest a price. Now that price can be potentially negotiated later on, but I think it's important to be clear about what is and isn't included, and I'm sure you've had similar situations.
Absolutely, and I think our advice would be that even before the fixtures and fittings form stage, as an agent, if I'm showing somebody around a house with a lovely wine fridge, I'd want to say in the kitchen, actually that's not at second viewing stage, that's not included in there. And if that's your advice as well, then that's really good to pass on to buyers and sellers. Buyers should be asking the questions of things that they want, and sellers should be very clear about what's not being left.
I think the fittings and contents form is also designed for a fairly standard 4-bedroomed house.
Yes.
So it's not going to cover off a lot of things that people may be want to include in their properties. So I would also recommend actually putting together a separate schedule of things that are either being included or are not. I've had properties where the entire contents, including lampshades, ornaments and all sorts of other items, have been left. The sellers have effectively just walked out of the home.
Wow.
But we've had to have full schedules of all of the items, and potentially a price attributed to each of those items as well. So it's quite clear as to what is the price of the property and what are the price of the contents. And that's very important for stamp duty, because the price is only paid for the property and all of that is physically attached to it, and the contents, there's no stamp duty attributable.
That's really, really interesting, and really good point to know. And then in terms of fixtures and fittings, from a legal perspective, is there a bare minimum? So things like a hot water tap, that's a tap. So does the seller have the right to take that with them? Do they have the right to take anything with them if it's stated in the form? What's your view on that?
So if it's physically attached, so if it is, let's imagine, fitted wardrobe, that would be something that stayed, as would be the kitchen. The tap could be taken because it could be removed without damaging the kitchen itself, but it would have to be replaced with something appropriate. So this is where it gets a bit murky, and this is why clarity is so important at that really early stage, because if you've got a beautiful light fitting, that could be removed, that may well not be included, but it would have to be replaced with something else. So as long as it can be removed without any damage, then it can be.
Absolutely. I think things like light fittings can be so expensive. They can be, sort of tens of thousands of pounds. And so if you want to keep that, let's make it very clear that they are separate items with a separate price tag on them.
Yeah. And also the case with gardens. If you're thinking that you may want to take a particular plant, maybe it's a rose or has sentimental value for whatever reason, you might just want to put that in a pot before you start having viewings, so people don't believe that that's part of your garden.
Oh, that's a really good tip. I like that one. Yeah, it's especially, long mature gardens that people have worked on for 25 or 30 years. That's a really good approach to have. Absolutely, thank you. That's a great tip. One of the conversations we're having with sellers a lot at the moment is the value of having a survey done in advance, and it'd be interesting to hear your point of view on that. What do you think?
I think it's great for upfront clarity. And I think that's something that can really reduce the amount of time within a transaction.
Which is what we're all looking to do.
Because ultimately, we all want the same outcome. Sellers and buyers are aligned. Generally, they all want to move as quickly as possible. And we hear that all the time, don't we?
Yeah.
The great thing about having that upfront information from a seller's perspective, particularly if it's a listed building, or you might have had a lot of work done, or maybe it's not been touched for 30 years, is that you're actually knowing what the problems might be, and you have an opportunity to maybe resolve them, particularly with timescales for workmen. We all know it can be quite hard to find a booking and get a booking for doing work in the property. So if we can get ahead of the game on that, then brilliant. I think you would probably have to just consider it as an investment rather than necessarily recouping it back from the buyer. And that will largely depend on a surveyor's attitude to whether they would be happy to transfer that survey that the seller had paid for to the buyer. And that's a conversation to have separately.
So to clarify that, so if we were encouraging sellers to have their survey done up front, traditionally that's undertaken by a buyer at their choice. They don't have to have a survey done. So a seller would choose to pay for their survey, and one of the options is potentially the surveyor can transfer liability and resell it to the buyer and refund the seller.
Yes.
But you're saying that's not necessarily the ideal way to approach it?
I think it's just, if a seller wants to do a survey, I think there's really good benefits of doing that. But
viewing it as an investment rather than looking to maybe sell it on to the buyer. If that's a possibility, brilliant. But also buyers may also want to do their own survey.
Of course.
Because they may take the view that they want to, they know someone, they've got a good relationship with them, they've done their surveys in the past, fine, that's their prerogative. But I think there's a real value in, again, getting ahead of the game. Usually in a survey there's a long section about legal advisors' points, and actually, again, useful for us because they may pick up an extension that was built before the current owner, and we can then look into that and work out, okay, do we need more planning documents? Is there building regulations? Is there listed building consent? And again, it just helps to understand the property better.
Absolutely. So the strength is understanding what needs to be looked at in a property, what documents you can get prepared, and that is going to be a real key point of the process in which you can speed things up. Brilliant.
Sure.
You just made a really good point about ultimately the buyer and the seller want the same thing. The buyer wants to buy the house, the seller wants to sell their house, and that becomes really difficult during conveyancing. It's a very emotional process. So talk us through that a bit and building your team around that, having people around you to support and get you to that goal.
I think it's so important. People can really lose sight of what that goal is when you're in the thick of it. And the longer it goes on, the more heated it can become.
Time kills all deals. That's our strap line.
It's absolutely true. People forget that excitement of securing their purchaser, and the purchaser might forget the excitement of securing the property. So the most important thing, I think, is having the right team, the right fit for you, because
Absolutely.
You want somebody with the same approach that will really understand the importance of this for you. And for us at Blaser Mills, we really care about getting this through for the client. At the end of the day, this is not a transaction where we're on different sides.
Yeah.
We just want to get the deal done for you. We do go that extra mile because I think sometimes that's just what it takes.
Really does.
And sadly for us, but the reality is the work doesn't stop at 5, and it continues, and we know the importance of getting things moving, keeping the momentum going, because without that it can get really stale. And I know that you've got really good experience of that, where it's frustrating for everyone.
Yeah, it's hard when it's Friday night and then it's a weekend, and then it will always be a bank holiday weekend when you're waiting for it. So, it is important to have that really strong team around you. And our approach is very much that people are selling for a reason. They've got a next stage to get to, whether that's for a new job or to move closer to family or to move further away from family, or to, there's always a goal, and until you've sold, you can't get to that goal. So having a team that will support that is how we achieve that, and that's really our approach as well, and it's really important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the more you can be confident in your professional advisors and have that early engagement, it smooths the whole thing through.
And on that note, we were going to talk about the sort of what are the quick fire things that you could do to speed that up. So things, maintaining the home really. So you were sort of talking about service people that you could get in. So what were your sort of tips for that one?
I would say when you're considering putting your property on the market, you should certainly look at having your boiler serviced.
Yeah.
If you have a pool service, electrical report, because although there's no legal obligation to do any of these things, actually the expectation is that you have continued that maintenance. And even if you haven't for a number of years, and we can all be guilty of that, actually the buyer wants to know that the property works well, because they don't want a boiler to be broken on completion, which I've also seen and is a nightmare for a buyer. So there is a real emphasis on upfront information and having all of that to hand. Things like air conditioning as well. If you have an air conditioning system, and many of us do these days, having that serviced. Again, providing the documentation and evidence of the service is so important.
brilliant. I think it's much better to try and go into it with the approach of that's not my responsibility, which technically it isn't, like you say, it's not a legal question, but if you want to approach this fully prepared and ready to reduce all the timescales right down, then those are the ways to do it.
Yes, for sure.
And actually, we were talking about the timescales in which we've done this. So what we do have people ringing us up, inquiring, registering to sort of to start their search, and they say, how long does it take to buy a property? Because many people at the premium end of the market haven't moved for 20 or 30 years. And we've obviously got all types of different answers, but what's your quickest sale that you've ever done?
My quickest acting for a buyer was 6 days.
6 days, that's incredible.
I like to think so. But it was extenuating circumstances in that it was during COVID. So everybody was very motivated because they weren't distracted by various other things going on.
Yeah.
But we had a very, very motivated buyer who was my client, a very motivated seller. All the information was there. We had no distractions of finance because my client had just sold his business. So he had available cash.
Yeah.
The searches, I believe that we got them back quite quickly, or we must have done, in order to proceed. So yeah, he was keen, I was keen, everybody was ready to go, and we could do it.
That's fantastic. I mean, not probably replicable,
No.
but, and let's not hope for another COVID, but 6 days shows that with everything ready, that it can be done, which is great news.
It can be done.
Let us know if you ever hit 5.
I think the key thing is it will depend on the slowest moving part of any transaction. So, you know, the norm now really is 3 to 4 months, maybe slightly more, because it will depend on finance, it will depend on a related sale, it will depend on all sorts of different factors. And actually, a lot of uncertainty comes with those timelines. So for me, I think the more you can reduce that uncertainty, the better.
That's a big part of what we do in terms of initial viewing inquiries, even before people have come to see a house. But obviously before a property is marked as under offer, is fully understanding and setting expectations around the way the property will be purchased. Is that cash? And cash means different things to different people.
Yes.
But it means liquid and available to move into somebody else's account, really. All the way through to mortgages and how close is the mortgage in principle to expiring. So again, we like to be prepared and set expectations. You know, this is a cash buyer or this is a mortgage buyer, and we expect it to take this long if we do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
At the premium end of the market, properties are more likely to have features like ponds and swimming pools. They're likely to be listed buildings or sit on private or unadopted roads. Those are absolutely difficult things to deal with during the conveyancing process. So what's your experience with that? How do we deal with them? What advice can you give to people?
I think, as you rightly highlight, they are issues, particularly also for rural properties. Having that information available at the start is helpful. I think with listed buildings, you have to remember that you also need listed building consent for any building work, whether that's internal or external, and that can catch people out.
Yes.
So actually, and also the enforcement period for listed building consent is has no end date. It's indefinite. So that in itself can cause some concern for buyers of those types of properties. So again, if we can highlight those issues early on, we can either, depending on the extent of the work, either obtain that listed building consent or look at indemnity insurance. As you said, with pools and ponds, people want more information about them, don't they, in terms of maintenance and installation and ongoing cost. So the more information we can get about that, the better. And private roads, again, a great example of where we might need input from a third party. So in those situations, we would be writing to whoever runs the private road, and there's usually a residents association or something like that, and be asking a series of questions such as the ongoing costs, any likely future costs. Again, buyers want to know that information. And I think the other big issue, particularly for rural properties, relates to private drainage, which I'm sure you've had experience of, because it feels quite an unusual situation.
Especially if you're moving from in town, a new build, a more modern property to this, absolutely.
Yeah. One thing I would certainly recommend if you're selling a property with private drains is to consider a private drainage survey fairly early, because that is something a buyer will want to know. Just because it seems to be working okay, there are a lot of pitfalls and a lot of regulation around how this works. And it's quite easy for them to fall foul of the regulations. Okay. So actually, by having the survey and presenting that with that information within the forms, it just helps them to understand how it works in practice.
Yeah.
And they are complicated, and we don't really understand them as
from our point of view.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And another point you made earlier on in our discussions was about indemnity policies. So there are points that come up that feel insurmountable short term, and then obviously people don't want to let the deal go stale in that short term. But you had a really good point about being able to prep an indemnity policy but not putting it into force, i.e. not having to pay for it. So what's your approach with those? What do you recommend to your clients?
So indemnity insurance isn't a legal solution, but it's a legal way forward.
Make people feel a bit better.
Absolutely. So it doesn't remedy the defect, but it allows people to proceed knowing that they've got insurance as a financial backing to whatever issue it is that presents during the legal process. In terms of the policy itself, we can usually get a draft policy quite early in a transaction when we identify a risk.
So this would be things like if you've had some building work done but you don't have the sign-off from the builder or the required local council or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So building control completion certificates are something we obtain them for quite frequently. Also restrictive covenants. So where your title has a binding obligation for you as a buyer or an owner of the property, such as you shouldn't complete any building work without consent of a third party. Yeah. Really common to see that.
Yes.
But inevitably people forget about the third party, and actually the third party isn't usually available to give that consent anyway. So the safest way around this issue is to obtain indemnity insurance. What we can do and what we have done is actually create the contract pack with a draft policy within it. So we're clear about we don't have that consent, but here's a policy that will overreach that as such. That offers great comfort to a buyer.
Absolutely.
They're not particularly expensive based on, if you're selling a property for £3 million,
yes,
a policy might be, depending on the risk, maybe £500. So
when you think of that as a percentage, that's a much easier way to think in terms of losing your buyer, which may have taken you 6 months to find.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a great way of being able to proceed on generally what is perceived to be quite low risk issues, but nevertheless could present an issue in the future.
Absolutely. And solicitors are trying to help their buyer prevent issues in the future.
Yeah.
And you said that you can get the draft in place, and if the issue can be solved in the meantime, you might not even have to have that, but if you do, you're ready to go.
Absolutely. And it's payable, we would put it on risk on completion. So nothing is paid until that point. So you don't lose anything by obtaining that
Best of both
early.
worlds, prepared, and you don't have to pay for it if not needed in the end.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.